Another thing that I talk about is paranoia. There are a million reasons you're going to lose this deal that you're working on. What are they? Let's start to write out what are the top 10 reasons you're going to lose this deal, right? We want to figure out how to win, but if we don't know what's going to derail this opportunity, then we can't overcome those objections in advance.
All right, we are live and I'm so excited for today's 10X Go-to-Market podcast with Mark. We were just chatting about some really good topics on how to find a 10X seller right before we hopped on. So excited to continue the conversation. But before, I'll just do a quick introduction. This podcast is for the 10X Go-to-Market community to ask all of your burning questions to leaders like Mark for everything related to sales. And quick background on Mark. He is currently the head of enterprise sales at Ramp. Prior to Ramp, he was the first enterprise rep at TripActions when it was called TripActions, now Navan, where he helped bring in more than 100 million of ARR as an IC. And before TripActions, he was at Highfive. So Mark, you seem to find and crush it at these insanely fast growing companies. So excited to learn everything, all your tips and tricks on how to become a 10X seller through that process. And I know we'll talk a lot about your career path, how you identify the right skills when hiring, how sales is evolving as an industry. But before I dive in, Mark, I'd love to just hear your background and how you got started in sales.
Great to be here, Alexa. Thanks for inviting me on and excited to chat with all of you today. I would say in some ways I've always been in sales. I don't know that anyone necessarily is in elementary school sitting at their desk thinking, I want to be a salesperson or a sales leader when I grow up. But I think you can very much divide the world into people who are sellers and who aren't. And when I think back to like early days, I literally remember going around my neighborhood at 7 years old, selling stuff out of a catalog with my brother. And I remember being in high school and I used to go to Costco and buy boxes of candy and I'd sell them illicitly out of my backpack to make extra spending money. And so really in everything that I've ever done, I kind of feel like I've always been, I either have that hustle gene or that salesperson gene. It provides me with that thrill and that excitement. It's also something that just naturally comes to me. And so I can't remember a time when I wasn't selling.
So this sales gene that you always had, and you divided people into, or folks into people that have the gene and don't, how would you describe that?
Great question. I think it's similar to people who are type A or type B personalities in that there is a spectrum, right? So it's not that, everyone is either in one category or the other, but people tend to lean more into being comfortable around selling, around persuading people, or be uncomfortable with it. And the people who are more comfortable, I think they tend to gravitate toward positions in sales. They tend to gravitate toward positions where they might be founders, where you need to persuade investors, you need to persuade early companies, prospects, et cetera, right? So like sales is not just selling things, but it's often selling yourself. It's often persuading people. And there are people who are comfortable with it and people who are less comfortable. You can become more comfortable over time. You can work at it. It is a skill set, but there is a natural inclination for it.
So have you ever seen someone that could go from, I just wasn't born with this gene. I don't really love it. I don't have all the skills, but have they ever become a top seller? Or is it something that you really have to be passionate about and something that you're innately good at early on?
I think you can become a top seller, but it's a lot harder for those people. Because you have to kind of fight your natural inclination versus doing what comes naturally to you and being able to really focus your energy on the margins, on active listening, on being audible ready, on doing kind of all of the little things that are required to be a great seller. You can focus your attention there. If it's not something that comes naturally to you, you have to kind of fight yourself in order to get across that line. So it's a lot harder. I have seen it done. I have seen people who are, you would look at them and you say they're not naturally salespeople who have crushed their quotas. They have to find other ways of doing it.
So now that I've completely taken you off track already on question one for what we're going to cover today, I promised I wasn't going to do that, but I did it right away because I needed to know about this sales gene you mentioned. So now let's talk about you and Ramp have done a phenomenal job hiring. And I'd say you've done a phenomenal job hiring in 10X sellers. And when I think about a 10X seller, it's not just a good seller. It's not a great seller. It's, the top 1% of sellers. And I think about them being strategic and scrappy and data savvy and using AI and all of these things. You have done such a good job of building up teams of reps that are 10X. What are the attributes that you look for when hiring these types of folks?
So I can only speak for myself and not necessarily Ramp as an organization from the hiring standpoint, but I have a rubric that I built a few years ago that I call the 4H's, which for me is really what typifies the sellers who are going to be those 10Xers. And the 4H's are hunger, hustle, humility, and heart. They roughly equate to intangibles that, when we're talking about the sales gene as an example, are things I can't teach someone passion. I can't teach them the heart, right? Like heart of a champion, being able to, fight through adversity. I can help coach them through a lot of these things, but I can't teach them how to have these traits. And so for me, like that desire to win, that grit to take punches and keep going, willingness to outwork everyone, that's something that they have to come to me already having formed. And if they have those traits, then it's easy to teach a product. It's easy to teach how to take advantage of certain tooling, right? Like those are things you just have to have a certain level of intelligence, and everyone has the ability to learn those things. But do you think you're the best, or do you know that there are other people who are better? And does that fuel you to want to be better every single day? Are you coachable, right? Like those are things I can't teach. You have to come with those traits.
So when you are actually, we have a question from the community from Gregory. Looking back at your early career, what do you wish you had known about sales that could have accelerated your career?
That's a great question. In my early days in sales, I definitely didn't know what I know now. So I will fully admit to that. I started up my own company back in 2009 when I was done with business school. And I was very much the chief everything officer. I bootstrapped this business. It was involved in the wine industry, which I used to work in. And I didn't know about software sales. The sales that I knew about was literally carrying a bag of wine to restaurants and retailers and selling wine almost door to door, or being a sommelier, or selling, lollipops out of my backpack in school, right? It was very much face to face, reading people, reading a room. It was not software sales. And so I didn't really have any sales methodologies. I had psychology. I had, that kind of raw ability, or the ability to essentially kind of read people, read a room, kind of understand the dynamics. But I didn't know, for instance, command of the message. I couldn't articulate saying, okay, well, what is the current state and the negative consequences of it? I wasn't doing discovery the way that I do now. So there's a lot that I learned over time. I didn't even know which books to read. I was very focused on my domain. Now, 10 years post my kind of sales career in software, I understand these things. And so that allows me to walk into a room and I'm already able to be 10x what I was before, because I have these skills that I've been able to hone.
Super, super interesting. And any books that you recommend your team, or any books that really kind of opened your eyes to sales in the early days?
In the early days, there's a good book. It's, again, a little bit more about the psychology of sales, which is called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. They actually have a bunch of really good books. They're brothers. And this one is really about whether you're appealing to people sort of or emotionally and how you get them to overcome these objections. And they use the example of sort of an elephant and the rider. And if the rider tells the elephant where to go, the elephant goes that way. And that's sort of like intellectual appeal. The reality is if the elephant wants to go someplace, that rider is along for that ride and there's not much they can do, right? And sometimes the elephant might want to go the same direction as the rider's telling it to go, but they don't see the path. And so sometimes you have to take this unwieldy project or complex opportunity and break it down into smaller chunks. So it's actually a good framework for how you are going to position who you're going to position to. So that was a good early one. I would say a more recent one. I love sales books that are not explicitly sales books. So there's a really good book by Will Guidara, who ran the front of the house for 11 Madison Park in New York. And
this one
took them from, this restaurant that no one really knew, is like a basic bistro, to best restaurant in the world. And the book is called Unreasonable Hospitality. Of course, I've got a background in restaurants and wine and hospitality. And so from that standpoint, certainly appeals to me. But there's so many things that he talks about that are so relevant for our sales process that I think most salespeople miss out on because they're focused on the sales methodology, or they're focused on the demo. They're focused on all of these kind of technical aspects, and they're losing sight of that human connection and that ability to approach it, Alexa and Mark versus, I need to go into all of these other directions.
You are the second person in a week to tell me to read that book.
Well, it's such a good book, and you can read it.
It's super interesting. So I would also be curious because you talk about this book that has nothing to do with software sales. You came from an industry of wine sales. Are there any unrelated jobs that make for the best salespeople besides just, B2B SaaS selling?
Yeah. And I love this question because I think that when you look at sales, it's very much about those traits, those intangibles, those abilities, which are not necessarily exclusive to sales. So I'll give a couple examples of things I did early in my career that really work well in sales. So one, I have to go back all the way back to like middle school and high school. I used to perform in theater. I just happened to fall in love with theater, and being able to sing and dance in front of hundreds of people on a nightly basis. One, I will admit, I love that applause. I love that kind of recognition at the end, right? That's important. But being able to do that, what did it do? It helped me to shed my Long Island accent. It helped me to be able to enunciate and articulate. It helped me to be able to read a room and kind of feed off of that energy. I also, in my early days, loved to write. And so obviously salespeople need to have really good communication skills, both verbally and in written form. And then the other thing was when I worked in restaurants, I was a server and then I was a sommelier. You need to be able to go up to dozens of people per night and instantly strike up a conversation with them. That's called cold calling, by the way. It's the exact same thing, but even more frightening because it's in person, right? You have to interrupt them or walk up to them, strike up a conversation, read them, be able to upsell them, cross-sell them, and provide them this incredible experience such that they're going to pay you at the end. And your income is fully derived from how great an experience you provide for them. There are specials every single day. Those are called new products that you need to be able to talk about. I mean, there's so many corollaries. It's why I think Unreasonable Hospitality is such a good book that's so relevant for sales. But I think anyone who's had that experience where you have to juggle multiple opportunities, multiple tables at a time, right? All of that is very relevant in sales. And I think if you do that job really well, especially in fine dining, where the bar is set quite high, then I think you ultimately can be a very good seller.
You're also not the first person to tell me that they had a background in theater or dance or singing or, working at a restaurant that goes into sales. So it seems like a similar theme, and it makes sense. There's also the bit of performing sometimes when you're, leading a sales call. Like you have to be compelling and you need to command the room and you need to tell a narrative. And so that makes sense. I like that more than just helping your accent, I think came out of that. So now you've hired all these incredible people from all different backgrounds and you have this makeup of a team. and you have the hunger, you have the grit, you have the humility. What are the top areas that you focus on coaching your team to be a 10x seller?
Yeah, I love this. There are themes that I think are almost always relevant, regardless of the seller you're talking about. One that I think is so important is active listening. Oftentimes sellers are so focused on what they're going to say next and their pitch and what they're going to say that they're missing cues on what the other person is saying. And if you know your product so well and you know your pitch so well that you don't have to think about it, then you can focus all of your mental energy on the prospect. You can focus all of your mental energy on reading the cues in the room. I remember a deal a few years ago. It was a really large Fortune 100 company. And it was a big demo that I was doing, and noticed that one leader who was on that call who hadn't been on before was leaning in when I was talking. Messaged him afterward. He ended up being a key champion in the deal and we're able to get it done. And it was just the subtle body language cue that
Physically leaning in.
Literally physically leaning in that allowed us to be able to unlock that deal. And if you're not paying attention to people's body language, if you're not paying attention to people's tone, to what they're saying, if you're not really answering their question because you weren't really listening, that's a missed opportunity. Another thing that I talk about is paranoia. There are a million reasons you're going to lose this deal that you're working on. What are they? Let's start to write out what are the top 10 reasons you're going to lose this deal, right? We want to figure out how to win. But if we don't know what's going to derail this opportunity, then we can't overcome those objections in advance. So let's figure out what are the top 10 reasons we're going to lose, and let's overcome those objections before we ever get to them. I talk about slowing down to speed up. And for me, it's like, well, you want to be responsive when someone emails you. You want to be responsive to the questions that people are asking. At the same time, you want to really understand, why are they asking these questions? What are they really trying to achieve? Sometimes it might be surface level. Sometimes there might be something deeper underneath. And if we're just in a rush to respond and be reactive, then we might miss the point of what's going on. A great example that comes up all the time is when someone asks you a specific product question, are they really asking you that product question? Or is there a competitor that's in their ear that's making them, have this fear, uncertainty, and doubt about your product? And that's actually what's causing this. And so if you have that paranoia, if you are slowing down to speed up, you can recognize these clues and cues, and you can overcome these things in advance. The last one that I would say is a theme that comes up really often is about being in person. And that's not just being in person physically, but it's being in person in terms of when someone sends you an email and they have certain questions, call them. Or if you have things that you want to present to them or discuss with them or you're curious about, why are you waiting a day and then sending an email and then you're waiting another 2 days or 3 days for getting a response to this? Pick up the phone. Better yet, if you have their cell phone number, text them, right? People like that immediacy. And if you call someone, it's very hard for them to come up with all sorts of reasons how they're not going to answer that question because they're surprised by you being able to talk to them in that moment. They can't come up with all of these different excuses that they can via email. And so being in person, being in that moment, whether it's again, call, text, or really in the room, makes a difference. And if it's you versus a competitor and that competitor's in the room and you're not, who do you think is going to win? These are all areas where I continue to coach on because these are the margins where differences are made.
So many threads I want to pull on here, but the one that my brain is exploding with follow-up questions to all of that. But since you mentioned competitors last, diving into that a bit deeper, you get a question from your prospect that, there's a question behind the question. It's about a product feature that your competitor has. Maybe you don't have, maybe you're weaker there. What's your follow-up to that?
So it depends on the specifics, but there's a few different ways you can react to it. It's, well, what are you trying to achieve with that particular feature? Or like what you want to essentially abstract away. You used to have this example where like you'd have a travel manager back in the day and it's like, well, we want a button in this certain place. Well, why do you want it? Because we're used to having this button in this certain place. Well, okay, but what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve here? Well, we want to achieve cost savings. Okay. And if you can achieve those cost savings, without having that button there, but in this other way, is that also useful to you, right? A lot of times, especially when people are very in the details, they're focused on how they do things today and how to recreate that situation. But what they have today is not good enough, or they wouldn't be talking to you. And so what you really want to get to is, what is the outcome that they care about? And if you can align best to that outcome, then you will win. The value that you need to provide, your core competencies need to match their required capabilities. So that's a check the box. And then it's about value. And if you can do those two things, you're going to win. So understand if that's what they're really asking for or not. And if this feature is something that's critically important and you understand why and it's tied to value, et cetera, then understand, have a conversation with your product team and see if it's something that you can unlock for them and if it's relevant for other companies.
Yep. Dan mentioned in the chat that you mentioned force management's command of the message. For your teams, do you use any of those traditional training programs, or have you built it from the ground up?
Yeah. So for me, I loosely ascribe to force management command of the message. I've been trained on it in prior positions, and I think it's a good framework for being able to run discovery and to really be able to articulate to a prospect what is their current state and the negative consequences, understand what their desired future state is and the positive business outcomes. It's a pretty neat framework. It doesn't mean that you need to be religious about it and spend, 60 minutes walking them through, the exact details of everything that they said formulated in this way. I think it's really just, it's a framework for you to be able to understand their current state and what they want. There are plenty of sales methodologies out there. You can provide a sales methodology for your team that works for the product that you have. And I don't know that there's one sales methodology that's going to be for every single company that's out there. I don't think that's the case. I think it really has to be unique to your specific product, your specific team, and what works for you. All of them ultimately get at, how do you do discovery, build a champion, get to the economic buyer, and close an opportunity? And there's a lot of different pathways to go.
That makes sense. And there's so many different topics that I'm realizing we probably have time for one more topic. So I'm going to ask you the spicy hot one to close it out. On a scale of AI will replace SDRs to SDRs are here forever, where do you fall and why?
So personally, and I've shared this with you before as well, Alexa, I do think that the SDR function is going to evolve and likely go away at some point. We're not quite there yet. I think that what AI is doing to the SDR function, especially in sales, but certainly other functions as well, is allowing them to either have superpowers or to be replaced, because AI can read a 10K, it can do research, it can create messaging, it can really take in this incredible amount of signaling that we have now. And at least at Ramp, it allows our sellers to be 4x more effective because they're really able to focus on selling as opposed to doing a lot of the manual, tedious work. In some ways, a good corollary for it is how many people, if we had a show of hands, if I could see everyone, enjoy doing an expense report? Probably nobody. Right? And you can ask that in any room in any company and the answer is going to be the same. Ramp does exactly that same thing. It takes the manual, tedious process of an expense report and it eliminates it so that we all can focus on core strategic work. And I think that's really what AI is about. It's about taking away that manual work and driving much more efficiency.
And I have to mention that's why we launched AI Strategy today, which, Mark, you had some great early feedback on the product for our AI account research and prospecting tool. So if I had to force you, though, to answer the question, is it that AI is going to do the work of SDRs, so AEs just have to do a little bit of prospecting, or is it that SDRs just become 10x superpowered by all this AI on their fingertips?
I think in the short term, SDRs become superhuman and are able to become 10x what they are currently or what they have been historically. I think over time, a lot of the function of SDRs is going to become automated as the AI continues to improve.
I am aligned with that. And what about for AEs? Do you see that changing at all for them?
I do. I think it's a lot like PLG from the standpoint of there are companies where PLG works. PLG works up until a certain time, up until a certain size company, up until a certain complexity of product. And then you need a seller to be involved. And so I think there are AEs that can be potentially replaced by PLG or AI, and you can automate some of this, certain products and certain segment lines. But I don't know that AEs themselves, certainly in enterprise or for more complex products and opportunities, are going to go anywhere. Instead, they can leverage these tools to automate things in their demo, to automate research, to automate outreach, to automate the buying process, right? Like there's a lot that can be automated around those margins so sellers can focus on their core strategic work that they do best.
And that piece is what you were mentioning earlier, going deep, uncovering pains, solution mapping their pains to your product, figuring out what are they actually looking for. That is all stuff that has to be driven by a human. All the manual, tedious work can then be driven by AI so that sellers have more free time to do all of this.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So so we're looking up. Sales is looking even more fun in the future. Is that what you're saying, Mark?
That is what I'm saying. I would say the next year or two might be a little bit messy as all of this plays out. There's a lot of noise that we need to distill signal from noise around. There's a lot of companies and a lot of money that's being spent on this space, which is exciting because I think it means that we're much more likely to get to the right outcome, but it's going to take time to figure out who does it best and how they do it best and what works and what doesn't. So it's an exciting time period we're living through.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that. It is a common theme I'm hearing is we're so overwhelmed by all the tools out there and how to use AI and honestly every function. And that's part of the reason we wanted to create this community because we're all figuring it out together. No one can, a lot of us that are deep in it can see into the future, but no one can predict it exactly. So we can all build it together. I know we're at time, so I want to say, Mark, thank you so much. This was phenomenal. I feel much more equipped on how to understand a TEDx seller and how to coach them and hire them. And I really appreciate all of your insights. And I have book recommendations. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. This was great. It went by really, really fast.
I know I could have kept going. And actually, where can folks find you if they want to reach out or kind of follow you?
Yeah, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn. I try to be as active as I can be. And so if you just send me a DM or add me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to respond.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mark, and talk to the community soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Take care.